Let food be your medicine. And that's exactly what we are talking about today with some really special guests, because we have with us Dr. Gloria Mosconi, Dr. Cristian Orlando, and the popularizer of science, Adriano Panzironi, whom you know well as a journalist and also as a writer, thanks to his book Living to 120, The Truth That No One Wants to Tell You, one of several books by our Adriano Panzironi. We've turned the page, and now it's time to talk about a topic that, let's say so, is a little bit in getting into a minefield, a field where anything said, maybe with a different nuance, could be misunderstood or understood in a, let's say so, inaccurate way. So at this point, I launched the topic with this video. Let's see it together.
Cancer represents the second leading cause of death for humans after cardiovascular disease. There are 3 million sufferers in Italy today, and about 1,000 new cases of cancer are added to this army every day. People who will have to begin a course of treatment that is among the most difficult in medicine, a path made of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, surgery, monoclonal antibody therapies. Medicine has been engaged in the treatment of cancers for decades, but there are hundreds of types, and for each one, a specific treatment must be found. The state invests significant sums in its budget. In fact, we speak of an average cost, for example, for a cycle of chemotherapy of about 5,000 euros, while for a treatment with radiotherapy, the cost is about 20,000 euros. The total expenditure, just for cancer treatment, reaches the figure of 18 billion euros per year in Italy.
And so here we are talking about cancer. I think already there is a bit of taboo in saying this word. Many called it dark evil because there is really a taboo, because this is one of the most, let's say, so as the video said, there are hundreds of types. So for each one there has to be, let's say, so a targeted resolution for that type there. Since we have the pleasure of having with us Dr. Mosconi, who is specialized precisely in diet and nutrition of the cancer patient, I want to ask her first of all if she can explain to us what is cancer.
Paziente oncologico, voglio chiederle innanzitutto se può spiegarci che cosa è il tumore.
As Benedetto anticipated, we should no longer be afraid to say this word, because from the data we have seen, it is a disease that is now an aspect of living together almost, because I challenge anyone not to have a person in their family who is not sick with cancer.
Quasi, perché sfido chiunque a non avere in famiglia una persona che non sia malata di tumore.
So we deal with it respectfully and clearly by saying those things that come out of my own personal training that has obviously led me to delve into the subject and then become a little bit of an expert in the subject. Tumor is a genetic mutation related to a cellular own genetic lesion that occurs, and this phase, as soon as it starts, clearly represents the primary phase.
Legata ad una lesione genetica proprio cellulare che si verifica e questa fase appena inizia rappresenta chiaramente la fase primaria.
And then you go on. Unfortunately, this mutation, it continues to copy this DNA that unfortunately has changed its arrangement. So you copy the DNA and the cells in a nutshell proliferate with the wrong DNA. And so here we are in a condition of cell proliferation of cancer cells, and we are then in this phase here in a secondary prevention until we get to the diagnosis of overt disease.
In una prevenzione secondaria fino ad arrivare alla diagnosi di malattia conclamata.
So we have these three phases. A primary phase, a secondary phase where there is the proliferation of the genetic lesion that occurred in the first phase, and finally to the diagnosis of cancer. Nutrition and supplementation in cancer is a real science, and so you have to be an expert in the subject, but certainly, I don't say this, but it is said by countless studies that have been conducted worldwide for so many years now, how nutrition, both in the primary phase, in secondary prevention, and in an overt disease phase, can and should contribute to an improvement in the evolution of the disease.
E sia in una fase di malattia conclamata può contribuire e deve contribuire ad un miglioramento della evoluzione della patologia.
Having said that, what happens? I'll tie in the sugar aspect for a moment.
dello zucchero
Then anabolic foods, insulin-dependent foods to the development of cancer.
sono dipendenti allo sviluppo di cancro.
In the cancer cell, sugar is not converted into pyruvate and then transported to the mitochondria so that it can then proceed in its metabolic action, but is unfortunately converted into lactate.
metabolica, ma viene purtroppo trasformato in lattato.
Now, lactate inside the cell cannot coexist. Of the cell obviously already in the disease stage, it is shot outwards, so we find it in the extracellular matrix.
Lo troviamo nella matrice extracellulare.
In the extracellular matrix, lactate, unfortunately, results in an acidic pH, and an acidic pH cannot coexist in the presence of disease. Already, it should not coexist in the presence of health because we are born with a slightly alkaline pH. So nature has predicted that human beings are born with a slightly alkaline pH.
L'essere umano nasca con un pH lievemente alcalino.
This acidic pH, unfortunately, is a cause of metastatic stimulation.
Stimolazione metastatica.
Not only that, during the presence of disease, other proteolytic enzymes are also activated. For example, metalloproteinases that go to, unfortunately, digest collagen, elastase,
L'elastasi
and so many other components, obviously, of organs and tissues that become the target, obviously, of cancer cells. And consequently, the drugs act much less. So what is the goal? The goal is, first of all, not to see cancer as a diseased organ, but cancer is a systemic disease.
malato, ma il cancro è una malattia sistemica.
So it is a disease that, unfortunately, then involves the whole organism. It is clear that there is a target organ that is affected. However, it involves the whole organism. Also, be aware of the fact that proper nutrition allows us to go to certainly bring our pH back to an alkaline pH of acid, which indeed it becomes,
D'acido che appunto diventa.
to make it oxygenated, because the cancer cell lives in a highly hypoxic environment.
In un ambiente fortemente ipossico.
It's just its ideal environment, and so going to oxygenate cells that are undergoing oxidative processes because of sugar. An oxygenated cell, of course, is a cell that is also more receptive to the drug. But how do we get to oxygenate cells through nutrition?
Verso l'alimentazione.
So I made a speech to return then to the origin of the question.
Then Dr. Mosconi, I thank her because that was really precise and timely. I almost felt like a female Panzironi. However, did you see that the topic is a bit like walking on coals? I also try not to be, so I want to address. Then I ask a really very difficult question to our Dr. Orlando, because I ask a question that is, this a poor nutrition,
Che è questa, una cattiva alimentazione può
can it cause cancer?
il tumore?
Certainly a bad diet can on a statistical level affect an altered cellular metabolism. Incidere in un alterato metabolismo cellulare. In fact, there is a branch of medicine called epigenetics that is finally developing, especially in the last few years, food epigenetics, in which it has been seen how much lifestyle and how much diet affects at the level of precisely genetic expression. For example, an experiment was done where homozygotic twins, so same genetic heritage, were separated from birth by having them grow up in different environments and with precisely different food styles, where gene expression varied depending on the situation. So absolutely, yes, what we eat can alter, can indicate correct or incorrect gene expression and therefore cellular mutation. And unfortunately, in short, cancer or any other pathology.
So before I give the floor to Mr. Panzironi, because Mr. Panzironi I know really likes to talk about numbers, I want to show you this video. I also want to show it to our viewers at home so that then we'll have a chance to comment on these numbers that the video poses to us.
The number of cancer patients shows no sign of decreasing, but is increasing exponentially. In fact, in 1977, the risk of getting cancer was 1 in 5. In 2000, the risk rose to 1 in 3. To date, we have reached 1 in 2. Following this progression, in the next 30 years, we will no longer be talking about a risk of getting sick, but a certainty. And so the only uncertainty will be what kind of cancer we will be diagnosed with. Even from the point of view of survival chances, the situation is not the best. In fact, cancers such as lung and pancreatic remain basically with an average survival rate of 16 and 8%. In contrast, cancers that have undergone mass screening have seen marked reductions in mortality. For breast cancer, the risk of death was reduced from 1,992 to 2002, from 63% to 53%. But the number of women screened increased from 10% to 43% of the population. This suggests to us that the reduction in the risk of death may also be distorted by cases of overdiagnosis, that is, diagnosis of cancers that would have remained silent.
So, Mr. Panzironi, the data are these quickly in 1997. The risk was 1 person in 5 of getting cancer in 2000, risk 1 person in 3. Today, the risk 1 person in 30. In the next 30 years, there will not be, let's say, so the risk, but it will be a certainty. We just have to go and figure out what kind of cancer we will be diagnosed with. How do you comment on these numbers?
Obviously, we are facing yet another pandemic that is totally underestimated by dogmatic medicine. It is true, as Dr. Mosconi said, that we should not be afraid of cancer as you were afraid before. But this fear, you can exorcise it if you know what it is and what you are fighting, because unfortunately, especially people who do not have specific knowledge about this tend to think that the appearance of cancer is a random occurrence. So you were touched, you were unlucky, maybe your mother and father suffered from it, and inevitably you will suffer from it. You will be affected by it in the years to follow. Actually, all this is not true for the simple fact that there is an etiology of cancer pathology and there is a degenerative metabolic process of the cell that leads to the appearance of cancer cells. So the tumor is not such a chance occurrence. It is simply the normal progression of a metabolism that is not working in the correct way. And then over time, the cells that are part of that organism begin to accumulate damage to the DNA of the cell, and therefore of the nucleus, and then inevitably made so many variations of this DNA, it will happen that that cell will take advantage, as it does in viruses, of offensive capabilities towards the organism to which it belongs. And then from there begins a tumor process that is also amplified by an inefficiency of the immune system. So we should not imagine that the tumor is an alien that is transplanted to us, but it is an inability of our body to go out and check to find the diseased cancer cell and not to have been able to eliminate it in the right time and in the right way. Also because we have hundreds of thousands of cells every day that turn into cancer cells. Our immune system has been precisely predisposed by Mother Nature to recognize those cells that are defined as no longer safe, as if it were a pathogen. And so our immune system recognizes them, kills them, and prevents proliferation. But what is the real reason for the appearance of these hundreds of thousands of cancer cells? It is the energy metabolism of the cell. A normal cell, first of all, has a low glycolytic activity, and on the other hand, it has an aerobic activity, which is the one produced by the mitochondrion. These mitochondria basically have generating sets. We can compare them to generating sets. Engines that use pyruvic acid and use fats to produce energy. These energy ATP, however, also produce a small percentage of free radicals that are estimated to be 2 to 3%. When we eat insulin carbohydrates, bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes, rice, and legumes, what happens? The insulin forces our cells to take in carbohydrates, this glucose that carbohydrates then summarize into glucose. And so the cells are forced to use glycolysis, and then using that you damage the mitochondria. There is even a reduction of sirtuins, which are cellular enzymes that lead to recognition by the cell of the damaged mitochondrion, Because we are non-immutable structures, we have energy structures that when they are damaged, they are repaired or replaced. Then this carbohydrate diet leads to an excessive production of free radicals precisely because of mitochondrial dysfunction, and these free radicals that are free to circulate within the cell. Cytosol also go on to damage the protein structures of the DNA and thus begin to induce alterations when these alterations lead to benefiting the cell in capacities that were dormant in primordial cells, because we remember that we are born from single-celled beings. The fact that our body is composed of multi-cells means that these cells are given rules. These rules were necessary to give these rules to our cells, and they are rules that are dormant. However, so when we don't have these cellular capacities that revert back to these basically primordial capacities, the cell no longer recognizes itself as being part of a tissue and begins to duplicate itself in an irregular way. Then there, if we continue to eat badly, we induce these transformations of the genetics of each cell. And then inevitably, eventually, some cell will no longer be controlled and destroyed by the immune system. It will begin to create a small tumor mass, and from there, the pathway will begin that will lead to the death of the patient.
So to simplify what you said, you are inviting is saying that you have to change the metabolism of the cell and then not have it use glycolysis for its own energy, but the Krebs cycle, then the utilization of fats instead of sugars for its own metabolism.
At the level of prevention, when we are sick, this rule applies even more. Why do cancer cells, why do they use glycolysis and not use mitochondria? Because being cells that duplicate all the time, cell duplication blocks the activity of the mitochondria, because obviously the mitochondrion is one of those structures along with the nucleus that duplicates when the cell duplicates. So what does that mean? That a cancer cell literally shuts down the mitochondria. That cancer cell, by the way, needs a large amount of energy because it is a continuous duplication phase. It is the phase where the cell needs more energy and uses its only fuel that it can use, which is sugars. So if we don't give this fuel, we are going to disadvantage these cancer cells that will become more sensitive to chemotherapy. They will become more sensitive to drugs. They will activate a more effective immune system, and they will be able to destroy because there will be less release of lactic acid within the matrix, and therefore the immune system will be able to more easily reach the site where the tumor mass has presented itself and go and destroy it. This is what has to be done for tumor treatment.
I also saw Dr. Orlando following, carefully nodded, as did Dr. Mosconi. Want to add something to this talk that your colleague Mr. Panzironi made here?
Aggiungere qualcosa a questo discorso che hanno fatto qui la sua collega, il signor Panzironi.
Returning precisely to the issue of nutrition related then to the immune system, precisely that is fundamental. I always say that the immune system never goes on vacation. Often we think of the immune system only precisely for flu, COVID, when in fact, as we said, every day our body unfortunately produces cancer cells, and we have this exceptional weapon of the immune system. Remembering precisely that the immune system is largely located at the intestinal level, so the moment we make a wrong diet, precisely we encounter a dysbiosis and we encounter an alteration, a massive weakening of the immune system. And therefore, unfortunately, the probability of getting sick with this pathology of cancer increases proportionally.
I want to continue to walk Dr. Mosconi over the coals because, again, the question is also very, let's say, so articulate, and it's difficult to answer in the sense I'm talking about supplementation. I'm not talking about preventive supplementation, but I want to ask you with regard to supplementation instead. After the disease, the pathology is concluded, I know this, surely you can confirm that supplementation has to be targeted based also on the type of tumor that the person has at that time, because it can't be, let's say, so a generic supplementation can give us a much more scientific explanation on this.
Absolutely, yes. So supplementation is also a real science, and therefore it has to be handled in the right way. You cannot generalize, you cannot, let's say, work in a superficial way. As Dr. Orlando Christian said, the first step in a patient already in the presence of
Christian. Il primo step in un paziente già in presenza di malattia.
Disease is precisely to get the bowel in order, that is, the bowel in an inflammaging condition, which is precisely what exists in the presence of neoplasia. We have precisely a condition of true major inflammation. The first approach is the bowel. A gut that is in a phase of dysbiosis, it obviously has to be rearranged. The gut microbiota has to be put back in place. It has to be made to start functional and function in the correct way. So everything starts from there. It is useless to do an anti-radical therapy, as Adriano also said precisely, with specific supplements that go against the presence of the free radical, because he went back, compared to what I said. He made a much more complete overview, Adriano, because the whole thing starts from a presence of free radicals that is above what is naturally expected in our organism, and that therefore our organism itself is able to counteract, because we have the tools to be able to counteract free radicals. When this presence of free radicals is so important, it is so obvious that the tools that the organism has at its disposal to be able to counteract free radicals are not sufficient. It is those that the free radical prevails and obviously begins to attack and modify a cell in its nucleus, then in its DNA, which then replicates, etc., etc.
Una cellula nel suo nucleo, quindi nel suo DNA, che poi si replica, eccetera, eccetera.
Now, anti-radical has its why, okay, of course it has its why, but I mean it is given at a stage when the organism is already in order. Okay, so you give it at a stage where the organism is in order, so you reset the pH of the organism, the gut, and then you go ahead and go on with reoxygenating the cells. Give anti-radical action just for a discourse of oxygen recovery for the cell, which then obviously then transports throughout our body. So the cell has to be reoxygenated in a condition of neoplasia.
So basically, in the overt disease, the supplementation must be targeted, therefore done by an expert.
L'integrazione deve essere mirata, quindi fatta da un esperto.
Of course, he knows and identifies the initial condition of the person.
So, Mr. Panzironi, I want you to maybe conclude this block that is so difficult and so delicate to deal with.
È così delicato da affrontare.
Dr. Mosconi is right, because in case of chemotherapy, you have to avoid taking example supplements that have antioxidants, because obviously, what does it do? Most chemotherapies go to oxidize and create excessive free radical within the tumor cell and induce it to apoptosis. So taking supplements that are antioxidants instead could counteract the effect of chemotherapy. But regardless of when one is treated, a minimal supplementation that needs to be done. And all the scientific studies tell us about the tumor discourse, and therefore the immune system, is certainly vitamin C supplementation, because vitamin C is a supplement that leads to hyperactivity of the immune system. Vitamin D, which is the basis of modulation, of course, of immune cells, lactoferrin, lysozyme, astaxanthin, acetylcysteine, are all molecules that I explained and introduced in the book Living Beyond COVID, which, by the way, is a supplement related to improving immune system performance. Remember that the Th1 system, the one in viruses, is the same system that has the ability to block pathogenic cells. So obviously the tumor, so if one has a lowering of the immune system, very often one has both viral diseases, but also the appearance of tumor. That's the first thing. Another thing that I think is important to say and should be recommended in people, these are studies that have really shown to have curative capacity, fasting straddling chemotherapy cycles. There are scientific studies that tell us that if on the day you have chemotherapy, 2 days before and 2 days after, you are in a fasting phase and therefore almost totally deprive the body of carbohydrates, the cancer cells are much more sensitive to chemotherapy and therefore you are able to get great results. One last thing I want to say to make it clear how important nutrition is on the tumor discourse. There are absolutely extraordinary studies that have shown that people who were operated on a primary tumor and therefore were not in the presence of metastasis, the difference from the appearance of metastasis was made by nutrition. That is, who, after being operated on, so theoretically the cure is achieved after 5 years. So you are waiting to see if there are any neoplastic cells that are left within the subject. At that time, a low-carb diet can really make the difference between death and survival, because these studies tell us that a Mediterranean diet leads, as opposed to a low-carb diet, to a 500% increased risk of metastasis. And so to talk about 5 times the risk of the appearance of metastasis, I think is really important.
500% di rischio di metastasi, e quindi parlare di 5 volte il rischio della comparsa di metastasi credo che sia
really important to follow that indication. Then it's time to thank my guests. I thank Dr. Gloria Mosconi for being here and accepting our invitation. I thank Dr. Christian Orlando, here he is, for being with us today. And of course I thank our Adriano Panzironi for being precise and timely in his answers.
E ovviamente ringrazio il nostro Adriano Panzironi per essere sempre stato preciso e puntuale nelle sue risposte.